فكلي واشربي وقري عينا فإما ترين من البشر أحدا فقولي إني نذرت للرحمن صوما.
Hello, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Islamic Mary and a Common Word podcast. So, a Common Word podcast focuses on Islam and interreligious studies. It is inspired by the Quranic verse 364, which calls the people of the book to a common word, and a Common Word initiative held in 2007 in Amman, Jordan. It interviews scholars, activists, and practitioners in the realm of bridge building, peace studies, and social justice. When I began writing the book, The Islamic Mary, I began to be interested in books on Christian-Muslim relations. And I've seen a new movement of books being published on the topic. According to Pew Study, by the year 2050, Muslims and Christians will be roughly around the same number of people and share the same percentage of the world's populations. That's why there has been an increased interest in the idea of Christians and Muslims being neighbors. Christians and Muslims are no longer looking at each other as the other and only within media, but it's actually people that they live next to and have close and intimate relations. I sit down with Amir Hussain to discuss his new book, One God and Two Religions, Christians, Muslims, and Neighbors. I want to welcome Amir Hussain to the podcast. Welcome, Amir.
Great to be with you. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you on this podcast.
I'm so happy that you're here, Amir, and I've been following your work for a long time and got opportunity to read your new book, One God and Two Religions, Christian Muslims as Neighbors. So first, as a tradition we have on this podcast, is for the author to introduce themselves. Specifically, could you speak about your spiritual and academic biography?
Sure, and thanks for that. So I'm Amir Hussain, born in Pakistan in Lahore, came to Canada when I was 4 years old. So my first language was Urdu that I could speak. Came to Canada, and so the first language to read and write was English. Grew up in Canada, in Toronto, literally like kindergarten to my PhD. And that was a moment like in 1970 in Toronto. Toronto was a very white, very British city. Now, 50 years later, Toronto is this, extraordinarily cosmopolitan sort of place. It wasn't that way in 1970 there. And so, you stuck out as the South Asian, Pakistani immigrant. Now South Asians are everywhere. They're masajid on not quite every street corner, but there are halal stores on every street corner. It's a very different world in 1970. Grew up working class, grew up Muslim. And so the Muslim part is sort of interesting because, there was one masjid at that point in the Toronto area. And of course, we lived away from that. And both my parents worked in factories. So you didn't go to the masjid as a regular thing. You went for Eid if you could. But even there were some issues, like if Eid falls on a Tuesday, or your parents able to get off work, very different world than one little halal food store attached to that mosque or close to that mosque. And that was it. Now there's a halal food section in the local supermarket. So, very different kind of thing. So to be a Muslim in a minority setting was a very different kind of world there. Grew up working class. And if you'd asked me in high school, what do you want to be when you grow up? I would have said a doctor. A, because that was the smartest thing I could think of. And B, as like the child of immigrants, you had four career options. You could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could be an engineer, you could run your own business, and that was it. There were no other kinds of things.
Hmm.
And my parents hadn't been to university. Both my parents, had a high school education. They both worked in factories. And of course, as immigrants, you want something more for your children. You want your children to have a better life than you. And so I went to university, and within the first, I don't want to say the first week, but certainly within the first month, that moment of, oh, here's a place where ideas are important. Here's a place where you can actually make a living reading and writing. There's this category called like intellectual. That's a thing. If you'd asked me in high school, do you want to be a teacher when you grow up? I would have said no, because I saw what my friends did to elementary school teachers and high school teachers. It was not pleasant,
Mhm.
Then you get to university, it's like, wait, the smart kids run this place, and it's not just academics, it's sports, it's art, it's music, extraordinary. So within, like I said, maybe not the first week, but certainly the first month, it's like, I want to do that for a living. I want to be a professor. And then it's like, well, okay, how do I do that? Well, you need a PhD. Well, what's a PhD? Don't understand these things. So my undergrad degree was actually in psychology at the University of Toronto. I think, like for a lot of our students, as faculty, we sometimes forget how students actually choose majors. I chose psychology because of the courses I took in my first year. I found psychology the most interesting. And so you take another course, and at the University of Toronto, you have to declare a major. So I majored in psychology with a minor in English. The University of Toronto at that point had like the largest English department in North America, extraordinary sort of place there. And, you're taking courses on English literature and you realize that, oh, well, you have to know the Bible. If you really want to understand English literature, you have to know the Bible. I didn't know the Bible. So I get to take a course in the Bible. But then I'm thinking back to the spiritual autobiography part. I'm a Muslim. Maybe I should learn something about my own religious tradition. So I'd grown up as a Muslim. I tried to practice as we could. Like I said, it wasn't like it is now, where you can literally, we have a masjid, we have a masjid with masala, we have a prayer space on our campus at LMU.
Mm.
That wasn't the case, back then. Like we sponsor a number of iftars. You didn't do that, in Toronto in 1970. So growing up Muslim, but not really knowing much about the tradition, in the same way that, you could be a devout, observant Muslim. And I say this to many of my Muslim students, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but, in my Intro to Islam class, say, look, just because you're a Muslim doesn't mean you're going to get an A in this Intro to Islam class. Just because you're a native speaker of English doesn't mean you're going to get an A in an English class, because the English class isn't just about speaking the language. You know, the Islam class isn't just, oh, what are the five pillars? And did you fast this morning? Did you pray Fajr on time? It's like, why do
Mhm.
you pray Fajr on time? What's the history of the prayers? How do you understand the movement of the Prophet from Mecca to Medina? What happens when Islam comes into set? All those kinds of questions that as an observant believer, you may not know the answer to. So anyway, I took an Intro to Islam class, and that was my first chance to sit down and study the tradition, the first chance to any systematic way to sit down with the Quran and read it. And you get fascinated in this kind of world. And so back to what I started with, well, I want to be a professor when I grow up. Well, religious studies professor, what's that? Like, I don't want to be an
Mhm.
imam. I'm perfectly happy in my religious life, but I don't see myself as an imam or anything like that. And this idea that, well, no, you really have to like what you want to study if you're going to go on and do a PhD. And so the choice point, do I do a PhD in psychology or do one in religion? Well, I switched over to the study of religion. The University of Toronto had a great program for my master's, for my PhD, comparative program. So I looked at early Christianity, looked at Islam, um, ended up writing a dissertation on Muslim communities in Toronto. And, this was in the late 1990s. And was able to get a job in 1997 at the California State University in Los Angeles. So no intention of moving out of Toronto, but in academia, you know this, there's so few tenure track positions. If you get a tenure track position, you move, and it may literally be
Mm.
across the country, or in this case, in a different country. And so I come to Los Angeles. This is 1997, and there's not much call for an expert in Islam. Well, 2001 happens, with the terrorist attacks, and all of a sudden people are like, "Oh, you're a scholar of Islam. You know about contemporary Islam. We need to talk with you." And so, before 9/11, I would give a talk maybe once every 2 months, 3 months, to a local club, a Rotary Club, a library about Islam, Muslims. Post 9/11, for that first 6 months, it was probably every 2 days. It
Oh,
was
wow.
it was just astonishing. And so doing that, and I loved being at the Cal State University system, state universities. So I'd gone to the University of Toronto. Almost every university in Canada is a publicly funded university. You see the university as this great engine of transformation. I mean, the University of Toronto prides itself on being both academically elite and rigorous, best research university in the country, but also this great engine of social mobility, huge diversity of students. You bring in so many students. It's one of those rare elite institutions that takes in a lot of students. Most elite institutions, pride themselves on how many people we don't take in. The university takes in so many people and you put them out there in the world. So I love teaching in the state institution in Los Angeles, but every year, the problem with state institutions is you're dependent on state budgets. You're dependent on state legislature. So every year, more students, fewer resources. And we had a chancellor. It's funny what you remember from literally 20 years ago. Had a new chancellor that came in. The state system had 23 campuses, but there's a chancellor's office that sort of oversees all 23 of them, even though they're sort of independent institutions. And the chancellor said he saw the value of the California State University system, and I quote, as creating educated workers for the California workforce. And I thought, I thought I was trying to create educated citizens for the world, not workers for
Mm.
California. I mean, don't get me wrong. I understand the vocational part of our jobs. Yeah, parents send their kids to universities so they will get jobs, so they will get better jobs than if they hadn't gone to university. So I understand that part. But I'm not doing vocational training. I'm not training you how to be an accountant. I'm not training you how to be a firefighter. I'm not training you how to be a chef. I'm training you how to read, write, think, so you'll be a better accountant or firefighter or chef or whatever it is that you want to do. So I thought, okay, is there a place that is actually doing this kind of work? Surprisingly, the place that was the Catholic Jesuit University, Loyola Marymount.
Interesting.
So if you'd asked me even when I was doing my PhD, once I finished my PhD, do you see yourself teaching in a theology department in a Jesuit university? I would have said to you, what's a Jesuit university? I don't know who the Jesuits are. Oh, well, they're an order within the Catholic Church. Catholic university. Why would I teach in a Catholic? I'm not even a Christian. I'm a Muslim. Why would I be in a Catholic university? Los Angeles. I love Toronto. Why would I be in Los Angeles? 20 years later, so I've literally now been at this university for 20 years. I can't imagine a better place to be than this Catholic Jesuit university. For longer than I've been alive, the Catholic Church has a declaration, Nostra Aetate, the declaration of the Church with respect to non-Christian religions, that talks about the interaction with other religions, especially Islam. The Jesuits, since at least 1995, their 34th General Congregation, have talked about doing faith in dialogue with other religions and cultures. And it's a small liberal arts school where we do value reading and writing and studying abroad and learning a foreign language, all the things that are being cut out of the state programs. And so I can't imagine a better place to be than at this Catholic Jesuit school. And so just one last thing by way of finishing, you'd asked about sort of spiritual autobiography, academic autobiography, that you start as a scholar of Islam in Canada, in Toronto, you write a dissertation about Muslims in Canada, then you move to Los Angeles. So you start working about Islam in America and doing that kind of work. And then, like I said, 9/11 happened, and all of a sudden the work you do is much more relevant to people. Then you have issues like the first Trump administration. Now we're in the second Trump administration, the Islamophobia kinds of things that happen there. And so, in a funny way, that there's more of a need than ever to talk about, to explain about Islam and Muslims in a context, whether in Canada or the US, where we're a minority.
Oh, that's beautiful. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I identify one of the things that I really liked about your book was you were very open about your biography and your global personality, being raised in Pakistan, growing up in Canada, and now here in the United States, becoming a naturalized citizen. So that definitely comes up, that global experience. And I went to Georgetown myself, and Georgetown is also a Jesuit university, as you mentioned. And I also identify with the idea of educating the whole person and also speaking to the heart and the soul. So wonderful. So maybe we could go and transition out to the book and specifically the title. So you chose the title One God and Two Religions, Christian Muslims as Neighbors. So I'm really fascinated with this title. Maybe you could explain it to the audience why you chose it. And specifically, can you talk about why Christians and Muslims? As you know, you're in the field of religious studies, you've taught world religions before, and this choice of the word neighbors is really fascinating. So yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. So a couple of things there. One is the book originally came out in a different version in 2006. So, post 9/11, the kinds of issues that people had about Muslims. Who are they? What are they doing? What are the kinds of things there? And so, you put this book out there in 2006. In 20 years later, you realize, okay, I need to revise this now. But half the book is the same because part of the book, and we'll get into this, I know, is, the discussion about Islam and Muslims, who are Muslims, what is the Quran, who was the Prophet Muhammad. That hasn't changed. What's changed is the framing of that. And so the book, One God and Two Religions, talks about the fact that here we are in North America, whether you're in Canada or in the US, the largest religious tradition by far is Christianity. You know, by order of magnitude, you look at the number of Christians in North America versus the number of Jews versus the number of Muslims. In Canada, like we know the numbers from the surveys. You know, like 20 million out of the 40 million Canadians identify as Christian, and 1 million, a little more than one, identify as Muslim. So it's a 20-to-1 ratio. Very similar in the U.S. And so that's the Christian part, that if you're talking to a North American audience, chances are you're talking to a Christian audience, just because Christians make up the majority of the religious figures in North America. you know, how do you then explain Islam to them? And the one God part, came about because of certain sort of evangelicals in America who will say, well, wait a minute, how can you say that Muslims worship the same God that we do? We believe that God as Christians is Jesus who comes
Hmm.
to earth in flesh. You as Muslims believe that Allah, isn't human, that Jesus isn't God come to earth. How can you say it's the same God? And you want to say, well, there's another group of people, right, who don't think that Jesus is God. That's the Jews. And no one says Jews and Christians worship different gods, because, the first Christians were all Jews, and it took a moment for Christians to emerge as a separate community within the larger framework of what it meant to be a Jew in the first century. And to say that, no, 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 we worship the same God. Now, we have very different understandings of who that God is, how that God acts in the world, the texts in which that God reveals, God's self to us. Yeah, very different understanding. So that's really the one God and two religions part. The other part about neighbors, I think, is really crucial, especially in the current political moment. I say that, towards the middle of 2025, where there's so much divisiveness. It used to be that we were a people who took care of our neighbors. Now we've become sort of envious of our neighbors, jealous of our neighbors. Why does that guy have this? How come I'm driving a old car and he's got a new car? How come I look in his window and he's got this big flat screen TV and I've got this, like we have this kind of zero sum game, that, if my neighbor has something, then I can't have it, or somehow it's bad for my neighbor. And I'm like, how did we get here? Like, our religious traditions, and this is specifically for Christians and Muslims, if you look at the teaching of the Quran on neighbors, if you look at the example of the Prophet, who talked about, how you are to coexist with your neighbors, if you look at Christianity and the neighbor, there's a religious commandment. You have to take care of your neighbor, not because it's your neighborly duty, but because it's your duty as a Muslim to
Mm.
take care of your neighbor. It's your duty as a Christian to take care of your neighbor. You have to do this, and we have to understand each other. Now, part of that for me is back to spiritual autobiography. I say to my students, look, I was born in Lahore. I grew up in Toronto. I live in Los Angeles. I'm a city kid. The smallest of those three cities is Toronto, and it's the biggest city in Canada. you know
Mm.
so I've always lived with millions of people. Like, in the city, you depend on your neighbor. You may not see it. You may live in apartments, I did, where you don't know the neighbor on either side of you, but you buy your food in a store where someone else, has grown it, someone else has packaged it, someone else sells it. You get your water from a public water system that someone else has built. We are dependent on each other. We are dependent on our neighbors, but we often don't see our neighbors as neighbors,
Mhm.
especially going back full circle to the narrative that you see now in 2025 of Muslims being the other, of being dangerous, of being disloyal, of being un-American. You want to say, no, we're your neighbors, and I think That's really the crucial thing. So the book really is an introduction to Islam to a North American audience, which, as I said before, if it knows something about a religion, it's about Christianity because the majority of North Americans are Christians. And so it looks at a way to help Christians understand Islam. In a funny way, it also, I think, does the opposite. It helps Muslims understand a little bit about Christianity and the fact that, well, some of these teachings aren't so different. Some of these teachings, some of them are completely different. Going back to the Jesus point. Yeah, fundamental difference here. Like, do you believe Jesus is God, come to earth in human form? Do you believe that Jesus is, one of God's prophets who's very special, but completely human and not divine? Those are very different. But how does that Jesus, whether you're talking about the Christian Jesus or the Muslim Jesus, tell us how we're supposed to work in the world? How do we live with each other? The fact that those stories, I mean, you have a new book, coming out about the Muslim Mary. The fact that Mary is this crucial figure, and we can talk about this later. In both of these traditions, it's not just Muslims that have Mary; it's Christians that have Mary. And I don't really say it that way because typically they think, wait, Muslims have Mary, Muslims have Jesus. I live in Los Angeles, and so the industry here is film and television. So eventually, everyone starts doing some work with film and television, and I got into it in a really funny kind of way. But one of the things I was really privileged to do was to work on Story of God with Morgan
Mm.
Freeman, and that was a project that Mr. Freeman himself wanted to do. He's not. I don't think he'd mind telling me this story. He's not a particularly religious sort of person, you know, but he's a very smart person. And he was filming a movie. I think it was one of the Chris Nolan Batman films, and he happens to be on location in Turkey. And he's a smart guy. And so on the day off from shooting, he actually gets a tour, goes to Hagia Sophia. When you're Morgan Freeman, you get a very nice private tour of Hagia Sophia, but they take him around and they take him to the famous mosaic, of
Mhm.
Jesus and Mary. And he says, "No, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. You told me that this was built as a Christian place by Orthodox Christians. Yes. Back when this was Constantinople. Yes. But then the Muslims took it over. Yes. And it became Istanbul and not Constantinople. Yes. And this Orthodox church became a mosque. And then the revolution happened and it became secularized. It was this Republic of Turkey. And then this became like a museum, you know. But why do they have the image of Jesus and Mary?" And the docent guy said, "Well, Mr. Freeman, Jesus and Mary are important to Muslims." And he said, "Oh, I did not know that. And if I didn't know that, and that's like Islam 101, what else don't I know about Islam? What else don't I know about religion?" And so I think for many Christians to find out that, and you know this better than I do, Mary is mentioned more by name in the Quran than she is in the New Testament. You know, I have actually I'll move my screen so if you can capture this a little bit. There's a icon there that you see. Brother Robert Lentz, who's this wonderful Franciscan icon writer, wrote this icon for me, and you can see the image. It's Mary holding Jesus. It's a Christian icon, except you see the flames on their head, because if you look at traditional Muslim iconography, we used flames rather than halos. You see the palm tree with the dates because, as you know better than I do, the Quran talks about Mary giving birth to Jesus under a palm tree. But the sentence on the bottom in Arabic, and I didn't tell him to do this. I mean, the great thing about artists is artists will do what artists want to do. So when Brother Robert wrote this icon, he has this line from Surah 4 that talks about where the angels say, "Oh Mary, truly God has lifted you up, purified you, and lifted you up above the women in all the world." And you know this better than I do. The Quran always uses this phrase, Rabbul Alameen, for God. God is Lord of all the world, not just this world, but the other worlds, not just this world, but the world to come, all this thing. And the fact that Mary is given a really interesting title, the best woman in all the worlds, using a parallel kind of thing. And if I said to my students, okay, here's this line, "Oh Mary, truly God has elevated you, purified you, and elevated you above the women in all the worlds." Where does that come from? Well, it comes from Luke's gospel. No, it actually comes from the fourth surah of the Quran. And so I think it's those kinds of things, like those connections. Again, that goes back to the neighborliness. The fact that, Christians know, of course, in Matthew 25, that they're supposed to take care of their neighbor, because Jesus says, did you feed me when I was hungry? Did you clothe me when I was naked? Did you visit me when I was sick? If you did this to the least of my people, you did it to me. Well, this is what the Quran talks about the neighbor who's close, the neighbor who's far, the neighbor who's needs this kind of care. Like we're commanded, so I said before, we're commanded to do this. As a Muslim, I have to do this because this is what I'm commanded to do to my neighbor. Not because of my neighborly duties, because my Muslim obligations. Same thing with my Christian neighbors. If you're an atheist, if you're not religious, you can say, okay, I may choose to engage my neighbor or not. There's no other motivation. For the Christian or the Muslim, you have to engage with your neighbor. You have to treat your neighbor in a particular way because this is what you're called to do. So that long answer to your question, that's the Muslims and Christians as neighbors.
Yeah, I love the idea of neighbors, specifically as you mentioned that when you're teaching Islamic studies, there is the stereotype of Muslims being perpetual foreigners. They live in the Middle East, as you know. So this idea of neighbors that they're actually in North America, they are amongst the largest religions and they're living side by side. And I love that point that this idea of being a neighbor is an Islamic concept as well as a Christian one. So why don't you walk us now through the book? You divide it in two sections. The first part it seems more of introducing Muslims and Islam, and then the second one you go into specific issues of dialogue. So
Yeah, and so the book, and I should mention too that the book I was privileged to have the book published by Fortress Press, which is a really good press, that's based out of a Christian traditional understanding, of things. And so the first half of the book is divided into two halves. The first half is really just the basic information, the kinds of questions people have. Who are Muslims? Who was the Prophet Muhammad? What is the Quran? What is Muslim? Basically, those four chapters, an introductory chapter, who was Muhammad? What is the Quran? What is Muslim life? Those basic kinds of things. Now, as I said, about half of that came from the first version of the book because that hasn't changed. Muslims still pray the five daily prayers. Muslims still fast during Ramadan. It's not like, we've changed that over 20 years or 200 years or, 1,000 years. What's changed is the framing of that, the context of that, the stories of that. And so you have, the Quran desecration in Guantanamo Bay to like burning the Quran, that sort of defacement of the Quran in prisons. You look at the images of the Prophet Muhammad at Hamline University and the sort of controversy around that people may be aware of, the kinds of things around Muslim life. How do you live out your life as a Muslim? So that's the first half of the book. The second half of the book is the issues for dialogue, including things like violence and jihad. You have to talk about, violence because unfortunately Muslims have committed violence in the name of Islam. Now, Christians have committed violence in the name of Christianity. Atheists have committed violence, so it's not that Muslims are unique in this. I think sometimes we as Muslims get tucked into this thing. Oh, no, Islam is peace. Islam's peace. Muslims. No, we've seen Muslims do some pretty bad things. It's up to us to say, you're not behaving as a Muslim when you do those horrible kinds of things. So those questions of, violent jihad. The other question, of course, is always the question of women, this notion of Muslim women as being oppressed and subservient. Again, without giving the book away, the chapter on Muslim women begins with the profile of a notable Muslim woman, Gigi Hadid. Now, most people say, well, wait a minute, Gigi Hadid, supermodel Gigi Hadid? Like Gigi Hadid, who's dating Bradley Cooper, Gigi Hadid? Yeah, guess what? She's a Muslim. Guess what? She's tweeted about being a Muslim. She's tweeted about, her Palestinian heritage, the kinds of things there. But, when you think Muslim woman, is Gigi Hadid the first woman that comes to mind? So, it's that kind of thing. So the second half looks at that and then ends with tolerance to dialogue and paths to coexistence. Like, how do we live together? How do we work together? Because, Christianity is the largest religion in the world. It's the largest religion in North America. Islam is the second largest religion in the world. It's probably the second largest religion in North America. There's probably more Muslims than Jews in North America. And so we have to get along with each other in the world, but here in North America. And so the book sort of looks at those kinds of things. So the first half really just the basics, who are Muslims and what do they do that make them Muslim? And the second half, what are the issues for both contention, particularly like violence, particularly around oppression, gender kinds of issues, and then how to move forward.
All right, excellent. Yeah, I really found this, especially the second part, really fascinating because those are issues that come up in interreligious and interfaith dialogue, violence and jihad, roles of women and men, Sufism, and then f from tolerance to dialogue. So maybe we could drill in a little bit on this last chapter because this is a podcast on Islam and interreligious studies and how to engage with others and form relationships across religious difference. So tell us what you're talking about, or what were some of the major themes in that chapter, and maybe you could expand a little bit here on the idea of Jesus and Mary being shared figures.
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple of things there. One is I was extraordinarily privileged to have as a mentor, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, and Wilfred was the great Canadian scholar of religion, I would say, in the 20th century. Without any argument, one of the great scholars of Islam in the 20th century. Extraordinary figure who was born into a Toronto that was even more Christian and even more British than the one I came to in 1970. So Wilfred decides in 1940 that he wants to learn more about Islam and Muslims. And he did something very radical. In 1940, there's probably 5,000 Muslims in all of Canada,
Mm.
relatively few, in Toronto. Now 2025 over 1,000,002, probably closer to 1,000,005, Muslims. Like
Oh,
when
wow.
when I left Toronto in 1997, I think there were like 30 masajid in Toronto, 33. Now there's so many more. When Wilfred was there in 1940, there weren't any. So in 1940, Muslims were the other. Muslims were exotic. They weren't our neighbors. Without getting ahead of myself here in Wilfred, one of his last books, he died in 2000, 1999. They revised one of his books as Patterns of Faith Around the World. The book was originally published as The Faith of Other Men. And he said, look, I have to change his title. The one is obvious, the one is less obvious. The men part, in 1960, we could talk about men and he and him as representative of all humans. We can't do that in the 21st century. We have to talk about the fact that, oh, by the way, more than half the world is women. How do we make sense of this and what do we do? So, I have to get rid of the men part, but I have to get rid of the other part because in 1960 and 1940, Muslims were the other, in Toronto, in Canada. In 2000, they're not. In 2000, they're your neighbor. They're on the street next to you. And so you
Mhm.
have to get rid of that other part. But anyway, so Wilfred in 1940 goes to the country with the most Muslims. That's before partition, India. Now
Mm.
Indonesia is the country with the most Muslims. And that's fascinating because, we talk about Islam, and one of the common stereotypes is that all Muslims are Arabs and all Arabs are Muslims. You want to say, yeah, no. Only about 20% of the Muslim world is Arab. It's a minority. And
Mhm.
B, half the Arabs in North America are in fact Arab Christians, and we forget about the fact that, oh, by the way, these people have been Christians for a long time. You want to annoy a Palestinian Christian, ask them when they converted to
Mhm.
Christianity, and they'll tell you, oh, about 2,000 years ago, when this guy Jesus came to our village, like we've been Christian longer than Europe has been a Christian. So anyway, all that to say that I love that about Wilfred, that he goes, for him, it's, I want to learn about Islam. Let me live with some Muslims. Let me go live with Muslims and take years to live with them, to learn their languages. Like Wilfred lived in Lahore for 6 years. I lived in Lahore for 4 years. Wilfred's Urdu is like the proper Lucknow, Delhi Urdu. My Urdu is like the gutter snipe Urdu. So, the fact that he lived in Lahore longer than I did, Urdu is better than mine. What does that tell you? Kind of thing. So for him, it was this no-brainer. And, he lives in Lahore from 1940 to 1946. I'm expanding on this point because we all know what happened in 1947. Partition, independence. India gets independence from Britain. India's partitioned into then, East and West Pakistan, East Pakistan now being Bangladesh and India. And within independence partition, you have horrific violence, anywhere between like 500,000 to 1,000,000 people killed. Lahore, the city that I was born in, the city that Wilfred lived in, one of the centers of that, and you imagine leaving Lahore in 46 and coming back in 48 and seeing the horrors, seeing the buildings that are still destroyed, the buildings that are still burnt out, haven't been repaired yet, asking for so and so and so and so, and being told, yeah, they were killed, they were murdered, you know, And for him, this realization that we can't do this, human beings can't murder each other as Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims did, in the name of God. We have to work here. So there's an imperative here. It's not just as an academic sort of describing things, but offering kinds of solutions here. And so that's where, long story, that's the tolerance and dialogue part, starting with Wilfred's example. You want to learn about Islam, make a Muslim friend. Go talk to some Muslims. I say this all the time. You could read any two books you want about Judaism, but you can get invited to your friend's house for Shabbat dinner, and you'll learn much more over the course of Shabbat dinner than any book. You want to learn about Islam? Yeah, read a book about Islam. There's lots of great ones. But get invited to a friend's place who will take you for Jummah prayer on Friday and have lunch afterwards. Who will take you for an iftar meal. Who will take you for a Eid celebration. That's where you begin to learn about, what is it Muslims do? What makes them Muslim? Where does that come in? Like it amazed me the number of people who, after 9/11, wanted to learn about Islam and they got a copy of the Quran. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think it's great. I think people should read the Quran. But this idea that, oh, Muslims wake up in the morning, read a page of the Quran, and that's their sort of marching orders, that's just completely ridiculous as saying, oh, you want to learn about Christianity, read the New Testament, because Christians wake up and read and I'm like, have you seen the policies in this country by people who call themselves Christians? They don't seem to be following this text. As I read the New Testament, granted, as a Muslim, it seems to talk about compassion for the poor and the unfortunate. The current political things by people who call themselves Christian doesn't seem to look at that. But it's that moment. You want to learn about Islam? Go live with some Muslims, and this is not something new that I'm saying here, and better than I do, there's a wonderful hadith of the Prophet where he says, look, the person that eats with us and prays with us is one of us.
Mm.
Who is us? Well, do you do what we do, our religious obligations? Do you pray with us? Do you eat with us? Meaning, do you follow our dietary rules? Well, then you're one of us. Like this is the thing I tell my students all the time. Look, you want to become a Muslim, it's easy. Just say in the presence of two Muslim witnesses, there's no God but God, la ilaha illallah, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, but Muhammad Rasulullah. Yeah, and you preface that with, I bear witness, ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu an Muhammadun Rasulullah. Oof, you're a Muslim. Now go do what Muslims are supposed to do. Pray, fast during the month of fasting, give to charity, treat your neighbors this way, go on Hajj if you're able to. It's those kinds of things. Like, to be a Muslim is really, how do you act in the world? How do you live in the world? What do we do there? And so I think those are the kinds of things that are really crucial. So again, back to the question, you want to learn about Islam, find some Muslims, make some Muslim friends. Not necessarily do what Wilfred did, live with them for 6 years. That may be a little much, but you know, come to a celebration, come to an event and do something here. That's where you really understand things. So I think it's opening up in that kind of way. The other part is, we often think of Muslim space as being the masjid or the masajids, and it's like, yeah, but there's other places. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've given a talk at a university. It may not be in a big city, and people will come up to me afterwards and say, "Oh, I'd love to talk to some Muslims, but there's no masjid in my town." And I'm like, we're at a university. Have you gone to the engineering department? There's probably some, people in the engineering department, who are Muslim. If there's a hospital in this town, there's probably some Muslim doctors and nurses, there. I know this town has a chamber of commerce. So I know there's a chamber of commerce in this town. I drove past it on the way to the university. 25% of American Muslims own their own business, so you're as likely to find a Muslim in the hospital setting or the university setting, or in the chamber of commerce, like doing business kinds of things, as you are in the masjid. And this idea that, no, it's only the masjid that's the sort of Muslim space, or you only find Muslims in the masjid and not, in the corporate boardroom, or in the small business meetings, or in the hospital setting, or in the university setting. And that's forgetting about, my background, because both my parents worked in factories. We forget, I think I'm talking now, we as Muslims, the fact that there's a lot of us as Muslims who are the underclass. People think of American Muslims as American sisters, people like you and I, academics, professors, people with PhDs, people with MDs, doctors, lawyers, engineers, professors. And yeah, there's a level of us who are like that. There's also a level of us who are living below the poverty level, who are immigrants, refugees, working class. And so, a Muslim in America may be a unhoused person, sleeping in their car in Los Angeles. a Muslim American, maybe Shahid Khan, who owns the Jacksonville Jaguars and is one of the richest men in the world. Like not just 1%. Like when you're an NFL owner, you're not 1%, you're like 0.001%. So a Muslim in America could be one of the wealthiest people in the world, or could be one of the most, poor and disenfranchised people in the world. And so, how do we understand, and this goes to, there's a current phase now in the study of religion where we talk about lived religion. How do we actually live this out? It's not just about text and ritual, but how is that actually lived out? Well, Wilford was doing that, you know, 80 years ago in 1940, going to live with Muslims to understand about Islam.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I love the idea of friendship as part of interreligious dialogue and interfaith relations because, as you know, a lot of times people just run to the text, they go into more debate mode and exchange. But here, this idea of just spending time with a person, getting to know them, and that's something I try to do in my pedagogy also when I teach, to have them actually go to iftar dinner, have them interact with Muslims through virtual exchange in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia as well. And this really remarkable relationship with Wilford Cantwell Smith that comes out in the book. I mean, that seems like he was a great mentor to you and really role modeled that that spirit of interfaith and interreligious engagement. So,
Yeah, and that nothing of my own merit. It's extraordinary privilege. I just happened to be. I grew up in this town that was Wilford's hometown. He taught at McGill, set up the Institute for Islamic Studies, moved to Harvard, nice place to be, ran the Center for the Study of World Religions, then retired back to his native Toronto. So I got to know him there. And then at the University of Toronto, working with these amazing people, like, on my committee. So Will Oxtoby, who was like Wilford, a Presbyterian Christian, Jane McAuliffe, who's a wonderful Quran scholar from, well, she came to Toronto and then went to Georgetown, and then after Georgetown, went to Bryn Mawr University, but a Catholic woman who's this great Quran scholar. And then Michael Marmura, and Michael was a Anglican Palestinian, one of the greatest teachers in Islamic philosophy. And of those four, only Jane, thankfully, is still alive. But this funny moment of here I am studying Islam with four Christians, two Presbyterians, an Anglican, and a Catholic, who know, like, Jane knows more about the Quran than I do, and so it's this funny moment of you, it's not just I'm a Muslim, she's a Catholic, she's a Quran scholar, I am not, and so there's really interesting kinds of things there. But just having that opportunity, it's the same for you at Georgetown. I mean, you go to a great university, and one of the privileges of that is having these extraordinary people who sort of take you under their wing, and then you can sort of, pass that on to the next generation, and so for me, there's just very, a clear moment for me of like, yeah, I stand on the shoulders of giants, and I'm never going to write anything like Wilford did. I'm never going to write anything like Jane did with the Encyclopedia of the Quran. But I can pass on her teachings, and I often say to my students with complete sincerity and humility that, yeah, I'm sorry for you because I had extraordinary teachers, and you got me. You know, I ain't Wilford. I can give you their teachings, but you sorry, you're stuck with me.
No, I'm sure they appreciate you as their teacher and role model and mentor. So maybe we can move to the conclusion. What would you say are some of the key takeaways, things that you want people to walk away from with reading your
Yeah.
book?
Well, in the book, and I don't shy away from the current political moment. You look at the first Trump administration, the Muslim ban, things happen. You looked at, I was so privileged, again, just nothing of my own merit, to have Jack Miles write the foreword to the book. And I've known Jack for over 20 years. And for those that don't know him, in the study of religion, his first book, God, a Biography, won him the Pulitzer Prize. Everyone that writes hates Jack because his first book won a Pulitzer Prize. Like, your first book isn't supposed to win a Pulitzer Prize. That should be like this is my sixth book and I don't have a Pulitzer now. I don't write as well as Jack, but you know what I mean. Like, but Jack was just so extraordinary in, writing that forward for me. But he talks about, this book was written, at the middle of 2024, 6 months into the war after Hamas had attacked Israel. And, it goes into to press in the middle of 2024 and comes out at the beginning of 2025, right at the beginning of the second Trump administration. And so you talk about some of the kinds of things because when that becomes government policy, when the policy of the government is to ban certain people of certain religions from certain countries coming into the country, you see this. You see this with the demonstrations about Israel Palestine and what happens there. And so again, you can't not talk about this. It's the elephant in the room. So you mentioned some of those kinds of things. So I think the takeaway is, how do you understand your Muslim neighbor? What are the kinds of things that might help you to do that? Do you have a sense of the life of the Prophet? I mean, one of the chapters I'm proudest of is that chapter about the Prophet Muhammad, because I think, and I'm not asking you to self-disclose anything here, but I think for all Muslims, there's a sense of the Prophet as being someone within your family,
Mm,
and the same respect and compassion, where you may disagree or there may be issues, but they're your family. You're going to stand
hmm.
up for them. And to see the mischaracterizations, the kind of things, yeah, the prophet that the right-wing evangelicals are criticizing is not my prophet. My Muhammad
Yeah.
didn't do this. Like, do you know the kind of person that he was? Do you know how extraordinary he was? Do you know how he treated people? Do you know how he treated his neighbor? I mean, you know the story better than I do, that famous story of the neighbor that, every day would dump garbage on him, not just on his property, but on him, and, kind of waiting for the prophet to do his salah so he can, dump it on him.
Hmm.
And then one day, like, the guy doesn't dump the garbage. What's the prophet do? He goes around. He asks, like, what happened to him? He's sick. Oh, okay. What can I do? And it's like, who does that? Like who asks after a man who's literally like dumping garbage on you? Like, you look at the prophet when he goes from Mecca to Medina, that's not a pleasant thing. You're kicked out of your home. You're exiled. Your community is saying, we don't want you here. You know, 10 years later, you're in the position of authority. You're in the position of power. You literally have the power of life and death over these people, and everything by tribal custom, by custom, you could kill these people. But he knows that that's not going to do anything. What's he do? He forgives them. Think about that for a second. Think of the grudges we carry because so and so, said this about me. That, yeah, they didn't force me out of my home. They didn't make me flee. They didn't persecute my followers. And what's he do? He does this. And so again, that sense of trying to convey to folks, and again, there's a broad experience. I'm not saying that my experience as a Muslim is the only one. There's 2 billion of us almost. There's 2 billion understanding what it means to be a Muslim, Sunni, Shia, Ahmadi, Ismaili, from the 10th century, from the 20th century, rich, poor, male, female, whatever. But to get some sense of yeah, here's who we are. Here's why the Prophet is important to us. Here's why the Quran is important to us. And so I think those are the kinds of takeaways, to help you sort of understand this in a way that's sensible. And I think one of the things I'm proud is the wrong word. One of the things yeah, I'll say it. I'm proud of the book is you write it at a level where people can understand it. I think for many of us as academics, we live in this world where we have to be as erudite as possible with as many footnotes and hopefully in Arabic and Persian and Turkish. And don't get me wrong, I'm a scholar, but this is meant for the ordinary person, written at the level of that person. So you don't need to have footnotes and things like that. And again, that goes to one of my favorite sayings of the Prophet: speak to the people at the level of understanding. You know, with scholars, we can use these in technical terms. With other folks, we can't, and we shouldn't. Sometimes we do a disservice here, but by not talking in a way that is understandable to folks. And that, stop here. That's one of the reasons I'm so privileged to be on your podcast, to be able to have people just, sit and listen to a conversation, because that that's really is what we're doing here, in the book, in this podcast. Having like two people having a thoughtful conversation is terrible television. You would turn off a television show because it's not interesting. But as a podcast, that's exactly what makes a good podcast. Can you get some information out of this?
No, you're right. And that's part of my thinking of starting the podcast is to make a lot of the scholarly material accessible because there's so much fascinating things going on in academia, within American Academy of Religion. But for majority of people, I think listening to a podcast is a lot easier to digest and to understand. So wonderful. So to conclude, is there anything else you want to share? Anything specifically you're working on now that
Yeah.
you want to talk about?
So a couple of things, like and speaking of the academic side, so I'm just finishing up for Oxford University Press, the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam in North America. So that, inshallah, God willing, will come out this fall. And that'll be a nice, reference work looking at Islam in North America. So doing that, and then the nice thing about the university life is the teaching. I get to teach a wide variety of courses, not just about Islam, religion, film classes. I'm starting to work on a project on religion and music. I mean, and that's a great example because, we have this stereotype, oh, Muslims don't have music or music is haram. Like, have you been to the Muslim world? Can you understand India and Pakistan without music? Can you understand Egypt without music? Can you understand Algeria? I mean, it's different music in Egypt than it is in Algeria than it is in India. But there's music there, like how do we make sense of this? How do we understand this? And so just being able to do that kind of work, I think is really crucial there.
Oh, all right, great. Thanks so much, Amir Hussain.
Thank you. Privileged to be with you.
And that was my interview with Amir Hussain. So many things struck out to me in that interview. First, Amir has this remarkable global personality. He's someone who grew up in Pakistan, then migrated to Canada, and then now is here in the United States. I've always noticed that people who have international and global backgrounds can see things in unique and distinct ways, especially within interreligious dialogue. Him coming from the Muslim world gave him a unique perspective, traveling and living in Canada and being a minority, and now a professor here in the United States, and someone who is living through a unique political reality. What also struck me was the idea of neighbor. Oftentimes, we think of Christians living in Europe and in the United States, in the West, and Muslims living in the Orient, in the East, somewhere in the Middle East. But now we see increased interest of people seeing Christians as Muslims as neighbors, living side by side, sharing a similar world, and having close and intimate relations with one another. We see that the idea of neighbors is a uniquely Christian and Muslim concept. In the Islamic tradition, there's this idea of the close and far neighbor that's found within the Quran, and that's someone that deserves your respect, despite what religion that they hold. There is also a prophetic tradition that says whoever believes in God and the day of judgment, then they should honor their neighbor, connecting the idea of honoring someone who lives close by to that of belief and faith in God and in the day of resurrection. What also struck me was this idea of friendship, that Amir doesn't believe simply in reading someone else's text or watching a documentary about them or taking a class, but actually sitting down and having a close relationship with someone of a different faith. He talks about his relationship with Wilfred Cantwell Smith, a religious figure and professor who was a wonderful mentor to him, who modeled interreligious engagement. He traveled and lived in the Islamic world for 6 years, studied and mastered Urdu language, and became a role model for many Christian and Muslim scholars in the field. I often see that folks who are interested in interfaith and interreligious dialogue and studies have a close friend from another religious tradition. And as a professor myself, I encourage my students to engage in experiential learning, to have an iftar dinner with Muslims, or travel and visit a local mosque, and to have relationships through virtual exchange and through global virtual reality with people of different religious backgrounds. In conclusion, I would encourage you to subscribe to A Common Word podcast, which is available on the major podcasting streaming services such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Visit the Maidan website for more podcasts, blogs, and videos. You can pre-order my book on the Islamic Mary, which will come out on September 9th. Visit my website to learn more about my bio, research, and blogs. And join my listserv to be updated about my research, speaking, and publications, especially my forthcoming book on the Islamic Mary. Thanks for listening to A Common Word podcast.